Hey everyone, it's Nick from Sonic Tone Amps. In today's video, we're going to go over effects loops, which seems like a pretty basic topic, but it's one that generates a lot of lively debate in the hallowed halls of internet forums everywhere. Plus, recently I was talking to some customers and going over the features in some of the Sonic Tone effects loops, and not all of them realized all the cool things you can do with an effects loop. So we're going to dive into that today, so stay tuned. So in an unofficial poll of local guitarists from around here and also researching internet forums out there, to me anyway, it seemed about 60% of people at least used effects loops and about 40% still just went into the front of the amp. So when I started designing the amps for the Sonic Tone lineup, I knew that an effects loop would have to be a pretty prominent and common feature. Plus, it's rare to see a modern amp these days without an effects loop, whether it's hand-built or mass-produced. But going back to the question of using effects in front of the amp or in a loop, it really is a subjective thing, and you can typically tweak the effects to sound pretty good in both situations. I'll let you in on a little secret. Up until I started building amps and the effects loops that go in them, I was actually really more of a front of the amp type of guy, but it was more out of sheer laziness. I really didn't want to bring out 2 extra cables and have to hook up the extra signal path. But when I dove into the makeup of effects loops and what makes them tick, I started to really see and hear the benefit, and really now I do prefer some of my effects in the effects loop. So to understand the anatomy of an effects loop and why some sound better than others, you have to understand that what an effects loop is attempting to do is make the signal compatible with the effects device that it's being sent to. In today's day and age, a lot of times that's a guitar pedal, and a guitar pedal is expecting a pretty weak signal with a certain impedance. So on the send side, you might have something like a buffer that's going to buffer the signal and get it prepared to go into that guitar pedal by lowering the signal strength, but also more importantly, matching the impedance. Once the signal's gone through all of your effects, it needs to come back into the amp through the return jack, and it needs to be re-amplified back up to the original level of the signal before it left the amp. And that's done with the second part of the effects loop, which is the makeup gain stage. The main reason an effects loop might not sound very good is it may be lacking the certain components and circuitry needed to preserve the signal as it goes out of your amp through the effects loop and back in. Typically on older amps, they may have effects loops that are passive, which means it's just simply a jack out and a jack back in, and there's really no circuitry to help match and balance the signal out when it's going through its journey. And typically people complain about passive effects loops, saying that the tone and signal really suffer when going through them, and it doesn't sound as good as when you're not using that effects loop. So most modern effects loops are built today with the circuitry that we've talked about to really help preserve that signal and make it sound transparent. So let's talk about effects loop features. As mentioned earlier, they're going to have at least a basic set like a send and return jack. If we move over here to these 2 amps behind me, you've got the Mercenary from the Modern series, and you've got the 67 Special Super Lead 100 from the Legend series. Both of them have just basic effects loops. It's send and return jack with an on-off bypass switch. If we move over here to these 2 amps, both part of the Legend series, this is the 78 Special and the Snake Charmer. They both have feature-rich effects loops, which include, besides a send and return jack and an on-off bypass switch, send and return pot controls that help you tailor the level of the signal going out and coming in, very helpful. A series parallel switch, which lets you operate the effects loop in parallel mode, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And both of these effects loops are foot switchable, which is very convenient to turn on multiple effects at once and really helps limit tap dancing. Back to the series parallel switch, most effects loops are in series, meaning the whole signal goes out and comes back in and gets affected by your effects. By turning it into parallel mode, it gives you an interesting option where you can actually use the send pot to dial back the level of the effects, and you have a dry signal that's always going to be going through, and then you can use the send pot to turn up the level of effects. It basically gives you a wet-dry mix. So again, I mentioned that both of these are foot switchable with the effects loop, and that's great for turning on multiple effects at once, limiting the tap dancing like I said earlier. But there's an actual additional benefit to an amp with a foot switchable effects loop and a return control. If you're not going to use the effects loop, it gives you actually a boost, really more specifically a volume cut that you can turn off. So what you can do is you can turn the effects loop on, drop the return control to where you want your rhythm level to be, and then turn the effects loop off, and it bypasses that, giving you the boost you need. Pretty cool, huh? So this is a topic that's very touchy and very subjective, but the most common suggestion is that you put your modulation, your time-based effects, and your reverb in the loop, and you put your distortions and overdrives in front of the amp. But that's not a hard and fast rule, and you really need to play around with each and every one of your effects units, putting them in different positions to see where they sound the best. You'd be surprised at which pedals sound really great in the loop and which ones sound really great out front. Mix it up and try and experiment on your own. What you have to realize is the effects loop is giving you access to the amp in a different spot, obviously, than the front of the amp. At the front of the amp, it is the pure raw signal out of the guitar. By the time it's coming out of the effects loop, it's been pre-amplified and has all the tonal characteristics of the distortion and EQ, which is an interesting thing to send out into your effects unit because your effects are going to act differently with that kind of signal. For example, your delays are going to be delaying and echoing a signal that's already been pre-amplified by your amp, versus if you put the delay in the front, the delays are actually going to go through the EQ and the distortion, which you may or may not want. So again, play around with your different effects devices and your pedals and see which position works best for them. Another cool trick is chaining amps together. If the effects loop is designed in a certain way, like all sonic tone effects loops are, you can actually send out from the effects loop of one amp into the return of the effects loop of another. And you will effectively make this amp the primary amp, and you'll defeat the preamp of this amp. These two amps actually have pretty similar power sections, so you're essentially creating a stereo amp. You're sending the preamp and the controls that you have in this amp into the power section of that, and you'll have a nice stereo image from there. Furthermore, if you have a stereo effects unit, you can go out from here into that and then send the left and right returns back into the returns of both of these amps and truly get a stereo experience with your effects. So that's pretty cool. So the last topic we're going to talk about is solid state effects loops versus tube driven effects loops. Different amp models on the market will use different components to drive their effects loops. In most cases, most modern amps and effects loops use solid state devices like MOSFETs to clearly and accurately process the audio going through the effects loops. Occasionally you'll get an amp that uses a tube like a 12AX7 to drive its effects loops. Again, let's take a look at these four amps here and I'll kind of break it down for you. All of the preamp tubes in the Mercenary and the Modern series are used for the preamp gain stages. So this is actually a solid state effects loop. Down here in the 67 Special Super Lead 100, it actually uses a tube for its effects loop to kind of give you more of that vintage warm tone for those effects. Over here, the 78 Special, tube driven effects loop. So this one has a tube dedicated to it and you get that warm tube tone here. And then in the Snake Charmer, again, all the preamp tubes are dedicated to the preamp gain stages. So this is a solid state effects loop. Now, the first question people ask is, well, which one's better? It's got to be the tube, right? Really, it's subjective and it's about the application. The tube-driven effects loop does tend to sound warmer and have a little bit of a good character to it. The solid state effects loop sounds really great too. It's just a little more clean and pristine. Like I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about these amps and their preamps particularly, whether you go with a solid state effects loop or a tube-driven effects loop is really dependent on what's available in the amp that you're designing. So when you talk about more of the vintage and classic models that are available from Sonic Tone, like the Clarksdale and the RC30, those amps are based on circuits that had tube-driven effects. Not effects loops, but effects. It was a tube that was dedicated to a particular effect, or maybe two. Typically that was reverb and tremolo. So the thought behind, the Clarksdale and the RC30 is, why would you limit that to a single effect? Why don't you use that to make a tube-driven effects loop? You'll have the warm tube tone, and you can put any effect through it you want, like reverb or tremolo or delay. So in the case of the modern, more high-gain amps, you're really using all the tubes to get as much gain out of the amp as possible. So it makes more sense to go with solid-state effects loops for those amps. Okay, so that about does it for this video on effects loops, us taking a little bit of a dive into what makes them tick and all the features and cool things you can do with them. I hope it helped you understand them a little better, and I hope you subscribe to our channel. Make sure you check us out at sonictoneamps.com, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.